In this week's Technique Tuesday video, I'll demonstrate how to weave in ends in ribbed or cabled fabric. You will find time-stamped chapter links to each section of the video right here in the video timeline, which makes it easy to jump ahead or jump back to a particular section of the video. What I'm going to demonstrate first is just the basic technique for weaving in yarn tails when you're working with a ribbed fabric or cabled fabric. Cabled fabrics are basically just a variation on ribbing because you're alternating columns of knits with columns of purls. So I'll show you the basic technique, and then I'll show you what if it's on a cast on or bind off edge, what if it's in the middle of the fabric, like we've got right here, what if it's something in the round versus something flat, what if that thing that is knit flat is going to be seamed versus the edges are going to be exposed. So there are a lot of different situations with minor adjustments that you're going to make depending on your individual situation. So the way we do this is we take our yarn needle and we catch the right leg of each stitch as we come up. So I'm going to go up, I think 5 or 6 is usually enough. I'm going to go up one more. So I have, I think 6 right here. So I'm going to pull the yarn tail through. And now what I'm going to do is come around the back side of this stitch. So I've come up through this stitch right here, through that right leg. I'm going to follow the path of that stitch around the back side. So I'm going to go behind the 2 legs of the stitch that are above it, pull the yarn through, and you can kind of give this a little stretch to make sure that this isn't too tight, hasn't pulled this in at all. And then you only need to go down a couple of stitches in the other direction. Probably 3 is enough. If you're working near an edge, you don't want to go all the way back down toward the edge. So then you can come through like that. And then you just pull in the fabric to make sure that everything works well, and then you'd cut your yarn tail right there. If you are working a flat piece of fabric that has ribbing or cables, and you have your cast on yarn tail and your bind off yarn tail, if this piece of fabric is going to be seamed, then you can use this tail to get your seaming started, and that will serve the purpose of getting the seams started, and it will also help deal with weaving in this tail away from this bottom edge. And if you need to, you would then join another piece of yarn along the seam to keep weaving in. If you have joined a second ball or third ball of yarn along the way and you have done that at the edge, because that edge is going to be seamed, again, you would weave those tails into the seam. You wouldn't weave it into the fabric anywhere else. If you were going to be picking up stitches along the edge, I would pick up your stitches, work that piece of fabric in that direction, and then later weave these yarn tails in to that column of stitches that you will have along the backside edge, and you can just weave the tails in along that stitch, that column of stitches along the back. If you have a situation where you are working flat, but those edges are going to remain exposed, then you need to weave in this yarn tail away from these 2 different edges, because you don't want to weave in the tail along this edge and then have that little tail poking out, or weave in it along this edge and again have that tail poking out. You want the tail to end up somewhere in the middle of the fabric on the back side so that it won't be seen peeking out from the edges. I'm going to run the yarn tail along this edge of the cast on edge until I get to a column of stitches where I can do that method that I showed you before. I'm going to come behind the stitch here. I don't want to go through this strand at the beginning because that's where this is coming from. So I want to come catch this bump first. And then I can go through this edge right here along here, pull the tail through, and then I can turn the work to the back and I can start coming up the legs of the stitches as I showed you before. And again, you want to make sure that that the fabric will stretch, that you're not pulling it too tightly so that it's going to be too taut. So when you're coming up from an edge, you want to come up far enough so that when you turn around and come back, you're not going to be cutting that tail again so that it's going to peek around. So you want to get a good 5-6 stitches away from the edge at least, and then come down a couple of stitches. I'll go one more up here. Come around the back side. Stretch it, and then cut the tail. So for the bind off edge, if this is going to remain exposed, often this is enlarged right here because you've ended the bind off row right here and you haven't turned around and gone back the other way, which is usually what will shrink this enlarged stitch. So one thing that you might want to do first is to help control that corner in some way. And then you can run the yarn tail along this chain until you get to a point where you can weave in to a column of knit stitches, because again, and you're going to again stretch it enough, you don't want to cut the tail along the edge because you don't want it poking out. So you'll then find a column of stitches. Now you'll notice that this column is upside down, and so we have what looks like the V's in the center, and we have half stitch on each side. You can go up the left leg instead of the right leg if you'd like that. Again, make sure that it's going to stretch, and then come around the back side of the stitch in that direction and down a couple of stitches in the other direction. So here's a situation where I've attached a new yarn tail in the middle of the fabric. So what I would do here is that I would link those two. I would cross those stitches over each other, and then one of them is going to go up and the other one is going to go down. So now we're in a situation where we've got ribbing worked in the round and we have that cast on edge. So we don't have to deal with that little corner that we had in this flat swatch. Instead, we have this continuous edge, and because knitting in the round is really a spiral, the end of that cast on edge looks to be a row higher than the beginning of the cast on edge. So this is a situation where you would use a technique for dealing with a jogless cast on in the round or a jogless bind off in the round. So I'm going to show this quickly. I have videos that show how to actually deal with this edge. Right, so this is crossing the edge right here on that stitch. I'm going to come through those two legs at the base of this one to kind of join that edge there. So what you want to do now is you want to go through the back bump of the next stitch on the cast on edge. So there's this bump right here that you can see. I'm going to go through there. And then I'm going to turn to the inside of the work, and then now I can do that technique where I'm going up the leg of the stitch and then coming back down. So when you are binding off in the round, after you bound off the last stitch, you're going to have one stitch left on the needle. And so what I do is I cut the yarn tail, and then I let this stitch get more and more enlarged, and I pull it all the way out. And again, I have a full video just on this particular technique of a jogless bind off in the round. So the first thing you do is because has that one row offset where the end of the round appears to be a row higher than the beginning of the round. So you have this yarn tail and you are going to join to the beginning by creating a chain edge. That final chain, you just took the last stitch out and you're going to recreate that final bind off stitch, but you're going to do it by attaching those two together. And once you've done that, then you can go up and down one of these edges. So you might be in between columns of knits somewhere. So if you need to, you can just go through diagonally through the backs of these bumps right here. Again, making sure that you aren't pulling too tightly. And then you can do the business where you're going up and down the column of stitches. There are many ways to weave in the yarn tails of your knitted fabric. The technique I demonstrated today is ideal for ribbed or cabled fabrics, but it's not really appropriate for fabrics that don't have columns of knits on the wrong side of the work. To learn other methods of weaving in yarn tails, check out the videos in the Finishing Techniques playlist. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rox Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.